This is one of my favourite parts of the symposium. Just, sorry that we had to wait so long to do it this year. Normally we do the symposium in March in the break in week 7, and it culminates in the awarding of the Andrew Little Teaching Excellence Award. For various reasons, we had to defer the symposium this year until T2. And so today's awardee, recipient, I should say, of the Andrew Little Teaching Excellence Award has had to wait since November last year. But as the name suggests, this award is in recognition of teaching excellence. Specifically, though, we are looking for contribution across different domains, including approaches to teaching that influence, motivate, and inspire students to learn, the development of curriculum and resources that demonstrate a command of the particular field, or other scholarly activities that have influenced or enhanced learning and teaching. This year's recipient has been with ACAP quite a long time, I think it's fair to say. And as well as holding a Master's of Education, recently completed a PhD, which culminated in their work, well, which I should say represents their work over quite a long period in terms of the scholarship of learning and teaching. So without further delay, let me please share with you and our 2020 Andrew Little Teaching Excellence Award recipient, and hopefully this is going to work, is Christine Chinchen. Congratulations, Christine. It's really is a well overdue recognition of a number of years of quite important contributions to ACAP and to our students. At this point of I'm just going to leave this up for a little bit so we can just all share that. But at this point, I'm going to invite Christine to say a few words. Christine, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you for the acknowledgement of the commitment I've had to ACAP, and I'll tell you a little bit about that and why I'm still so passionate. I can't get this out of my bloodstream. I think I'll be on my deathbed saying to the nurses, so what are you saying I have to have? What are the medications I need to do and what do they do? I'll just be that kind of person. So let me begin. So today it is a great honour to be the recipient of this particular teaching award, and it will become clear in a moment why this matters so much to me. So this is my plan. I want to have the acknowledgement of the award to begin with. Then I want to try and unpack this notion of teaching excellence. And we've heard a bit about it today, particularly the avoidance, I think, of that idea that excellence is the peak of the hill. It's the person you look up to and you go, oh, wow, because if that's teaching excellence, then I'm in the wrong place. Because it's always about collaboration for me. It's always about being on the leading edge, and it's always about learning. And then I'll conclude with a couple of thoughts, and then we'll have a Q&A. So I want to we're going to go meta as I go through because I can't do it any other way. ACAP has trained me so well in being experiential, but explaining what I'm doing. So for all of us as educators, spatial predictability guides attention. So that's why I use the little clock there to get us around. And normally I have time frames on it. And I use this as part of providing the whole part whole approach to learning and teaching. Students often get lost in the middle of wherever we're trying to take them. So it's important to explicate that clearly. All of the things I'm going to talk about today, I can say, I know they work because the learners have told me. So I know they work from a research point of view because I've read the research, but when the learners at ACAP say, wow, I really like that, or that made sense to me, or it created a learning opportunity, then that to me is a reinforcement that what I'm doing is working. And of course, I refine all the time. So the Andrew Little Teaching Excellence Award lecture I have named the Heart of ACAP, and Andrew of course was the Heart of ACAP for many years. So today's lecture is a homage both to Andrew's role in the college as well as mine. And this is a picture that I took when Andrew and I were actually over in Singapore and KL together. We were doing an audit of a college that, as you can see there, the Australian College of Applied Psychology. We had an agreement and we went over there, and this is going to give somewhat of both of our ages away. We were introducing Turnitin at ACAP, and we were training up the staff over there. And I did what I'm well known for, of trying to give professional development about how to save your time, effort and energy and provide excellent feedback for learners for their next loop of learning. So Andrew and I spent many hours not only there, but we also worked together in ACAP for many years. And in addition to that, we sat on the Society of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education Board, which is a national board that is now been absorbed into PACFA. So we spent many hours, in fact, in the ACAP boardroom while we were in SCAPE meetings. And in addition to that, Andrew and I were well known for cutting a bit of a rug up on the dance floor together at SCAPE conferences. So we had a good personal relationship as well as a professional relationship. And of course, SCAPE was a member organisation of PACFA. So we went to many of the PACFA meetings in the early days. So it was a lot of fun. So when I joined ACAP, and I want to provide a learning ecology back then, so we're talking about the early 1990s. When I joined, I just have some figures for you to contemplate. So I will decipher the figures for you. One campus, it was in Sydney on the corner of Devonshire and Elizabeth Street, or just a little bit up from there. One training room, undergrads, Mondays and Tuesdays, postgrads, Thursdays and Fridays. Wednesday was our day off. About 15 staff. So as Margaret Mead said, you know, paraphrased, don't ever underestimate what a small group of people can do. 15 undergraduate students and 17 postgraduate students. So I think that we could all agree that perhaps ACAP has grown a little bit. But it takes a village to do that. So I want to tip my hat to everybody in the village because what I'm going to talk about now really singles out the educators, which makes sense because this is a Teaching Excellence Award. And I do have a bias, having in that initial group of 15 people, some of us were on staff. Eileen Davis was a Director of Studies. I was Assistant Director of Studies, and we taught together on the postgrad course. So there was other sessional educators that we worked with and really enjoyed growing our village of educators. But of course, everybody in what's often referred to as the back room, I don't think it's quite like that. Everybody makes a contribution. If you're in ACAP, you're making a contribution of one form or another. So this comes from Norman Jackson's work on learning ecologies. And it really is about trying to figure out, if we're preparing people for such a complex world now, how do we go about that? And his key concept that he really brought to the fore was that lifelong learning is important. And we'd heard about that when I was back doing my Bachelor of Adult Ed in the early 90s. But it's also life-wide, which means when I teach, I bring in everything. The other day when I was in a workshop and I was talking about Ash Barty playing Wimbledon that night. And I said, did you see the pre-interview? She is so humble. She embodies what I think great humility, great characteristics are all about. And then I posted a little link to my students afterwards, because we were doing counselling, mental health counselling. And I posted a link afterwards, because we need to all the time be thinking these are real human beings in front of us. Yes, they're students, yes, they're learners, but so are we. And we want to go lifelong and life-wide. So I just want you to take a moment and think about how do you see the connection between teaching and learning? And this is a private discussion, because in the 25 minutes I have, we don't have time for a backwards and forwards, but perhaps we could continue this in Yammer or wherever else. So what do you think is the connection between teaching and learning? And normally at this point of time in a presentation, I would quote Paul Ramsden, that the aim of teaching is straightforward, really. It's to create opportunities for learning. But that was back in 2006 that he wrote his book on higher ed teaching. So I thought I'd update us a little bit with a beautiful illustration that I found in a 2016 book. Now, I'm going to run us through this, and because of the holistic nature of this, I didn't want to chop it up in any way. So this is called The Theatre of Knowing, and Taylor and Marino really talk beautifully about this in their Facilitating Learning with the Adult Brain in Mind. So if we talk about where facilitation focuses, that's really the teaching side. The curtain of awareness is where the transition occurs between what we as educators might know and how the learners can actually start to embody some of the things that we discuss in classes. And then the learning occurs, and it does tend to be, although influenced by outside circumstances and connections, it does tend to happen within the learner. So all of the things here about concepts and feelings and all of that, that's great. And we've changed our philosophy, as you've already seen today in some of the presentations. We're using images a lot more. We use videos a lot more. Mark Treadwell, who's done a lot of work in this area, calls it the 5th paradigm of education. Got a question? Want to see somebody do it? YouTube it. And that's the kind of way that those sort of artifacts are now being used in all sorts of education. The problem is if we stay over that side, then we're content oriented, and we know that people have to construct their own learning and their own knowledge. So that's why we shift over this side and we have a look at what do we need to pay attention to there. And as you can see, things like emotions and analogies, models, narratives, connections, all of those things come up. So if I was to think about what teaching excellence is, I am just going to take the big picture there is teaching excellence, but I'm just going to narrow in on a couple of things. And in order to narrow down, I could use a whole range of frameworks and all of that, but I've gone to my friend, Peter Senge, who, when I was doing my bachelor's, his now famous best-selling book came out, The Fifth Discipline, which was the art and practice of the learning organisation. So it's management literature, and given I have my initial qualification was in HR management, I was really keen to have a look at this and see how it could fit for the learning organisation actually being one that focuses on learning. Now, here's his disciplines of a learning organisation, and I just want you for a moment to think about all of these disciplines. And I'm wondering right at this very moment, as you look at that slide, how's it working for you? Maybe you could put in the chat how it's working for you as I'm talking to it and you're trying to work out where to put your attention. If you don't want to put it in the chat, I'll just make the assumption that you, like I, cannot look at something that big, that detailed, and listen to somebody at the same time. So we turn to the Science of Learning Research Centre in Queensland. So I have pre-activated some strategies to guide learning. So I'm already asking you to reflect. And we talked about that in our group with Sue around how do we get people to get into that critical reflection space? We invite them in. We say, what does that make? Does that make sense to you? How does this fit together? You might know you're also involved in active learning now because I've asked you to write down something or to think about it. We know that written text and spoken word don't mix. So that diagram with my words over the top of it are just going to create a lot of noise for you. They will not create learning. But visual images and spoken word mix well. So let's give it another go. So this is Peter Sengi's Disciplines of Learning Organisation. First one is about systems thinking, mental models, shared vision, personal mastery, which is the one that we've got the most control over, I think, as individuals, and team learning. So he suggests that systems thinking is about comprehending and addressing the whole and examining the interrelationships between the parts. You've heard that talked about today under ecological thinking. That's why we have to pay homage to all of the interrelationships, not just the ones that we specifically work in. So the mental models are deeply ingrained, and of course our learners come in with their own mental models. But once we get them to reflect on them and also reflect on their skills in action, they start to shift their mental models. And we can too. A lot of the time we talk about managing learning. Managing is not where it's at. Managing is just kind of coordinating and organising the tasks that are required. It really needs visioning and leading. And with that vision, people can excel and learn. It's one of the reasons that ACAP was so successful in its early years was that we had a vision of applying what we did. We had people in rooms right from week one, talking to each other, developing their skills. They weren't necessarily always aware of what we were doing, but by the end of it, they would have integrated at such a deep level, that shared vision, that it's human to human. That's what we're trying to do in all of our professions. And we're continually trying to reflect and clarify and deepen our personal vision, and that leads to our personal mastery. And then we have this process of aligning and developing the capacities of our team to create the results. And so that takes the village of the internal learning group, the ecology, we call it a class or we call it a cohort. But of course, everybody involved in that process, again, supports that endeavour. So if I was just to think about what systems thinking means for me, it's about learning ecology. Mental models as an educator for learning and teaching, but it's also, of course, a discipline. Shared vision, it's all about authentic connection. Without that, we have nothing. Personal mastery as an educator and a learner. And I'll come back to that in a moment. With team learning, that's about collaborative and active learning in a supportive learning environment. So if I think about learning, it is all about connections. And when I did my PhD research, one of the people who will remain nameless, but I wasn't working at ACAP when I did my PhD, but this person was. And when I said, you know, we've talked about learning for a while, what do you think learning is from a definition point of view? And her comment was, it's the formation of dendritic connections. Very neuroscience response, but it is about connections. So connecting concepts, we're also connecting with ourselves, and that's one of the things our learners do that's very different to a theoretical approach. They're all the time reflecting on themselves, and it's a very uncomfortable position for many of them at different points of time. Connecting the past, present and future, which is where we as educators can provide the really lovely intersection between being an experienced pracademic, coming into being an academic, and working with them and giving them the real world experiences. Human and social connections, if they can do the human and social connections in our rooms, they are then upskilled, ready to do it with a variety of people that they might be working with. Of course, neural connections, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. Connecting of human networks. And what was interesting, this is about personal learning areas. And it was mentioned before that we have MALT units. And in MALT 1035, what the students present is their personal learning environment, their PLEs, and they're always fascinating to learn from. Also connecting objects to one another and connecting with the internet more and more. So as I think about the heart of ACAP, we are not in a sausage line production. This comes from a book I wrote back in 1994, which makes me feel very old and decrepit, but there you go. So all of these wonderful people come in, they're all different shapes and sizes, and often the traditional view of education and training is they all come out looking like each other. And that's one of the things I really value about inclusiveness and diversity at ACAP. And as I mentioned before earlier in the presentation, it scares me, the idea of me thinking that for other people to be successful, they have to be me. Nobody else can be me, and I can't be any of you. So it's about encouraging our learners to be the best they can be, the way they do it. So some people that have helped me along the way, and this is my learning connections. This is Barb Oakley, who is the leader of probably the most successful MOOC, Massive Open Online Course on Learning to Learn. I'm part of her community, and Barb has cost me a lot of money, I have to tell you, because each week I get a newsletter with the latest books, the latest articles, and I am on fish pond immediately when that comes through. This is David Kolb. When Lionel Davis was organising the basic educational model, he was looking at experiential learning. And I, as a student of Bachelor of Adult Ed, was looking at Kolb. So it was magic when I came in for the interview and Lionel said to me, so do you know anything about experiential learning? To which my response was, well, yes, I actually do. And so we had a good chat about how we were going to apply that particular model in ACAP. Nelson Dellis, for those of you who don't know, he is 4 times USA memory champion. I'm doing his memory course at the moment. And I'm testing some of the strategies because I'm not looking at any notes. So if I forget something, it's Nelson's fault, not mine. He hasn't taught me well enough yet. Or maybe I just need to practice a bit more. This is Antonio Damasio and Mary Helen Immordino Yang. These two have been so influential in my understanding of how neuroscience fits with learning, and particularly the affect in neuroscience. Richard Branson, who of course on the weekend took off on his spaceship Galactica for a brief 10-minute rise around and came back. I love his dreaming, and I'm on his newsletter. So he's always dreaming about new things. Anybody who has the audacity to name a company Virgin, I've got to take my hat off to them. But he also reminds me of an important thing, and that is that neurodiversity is actually a superpower. And he has multiple classifiable neurodiverse aspects of himself. And I really admire the fact that he has developed strategies, and now he's so successful in so many ways. John Hattie, of course, who's come more recently on the scene, not as in terms of being recent as an educator and researcher, but his visible learning set of books all of a sudden woke a whole lot of people up to what has been in the research documents before, but it was made accessible. And John Biggs, who is now retired, is 86, I think, but he was the person that first introduced me to constructive alignment. Make sure everything you do in the room is contributing to learning, understand what you're trying to achieve, all of those things. And I don't know, I can't say for sure whether that's a background of him where he lives down in Tassie, although I've lived in Tassie, but I'm not going to back it and say that's definitely the background there. But I think all of these people, plus hundreds and hundreds more, have influenced my learning. So why I've told you about that is when we're in a teaching environment, we always want to try and find the story behind the fact. And that's why I introduced you via pictures and then named it and then told you a little story about why they mattered to me. Now, you may not remember the detail of that story. You may even not remember their names, but you'll remember something out of that, if not just their image, perhaps. In the same way, I tried to give you a story behind the fact that this award particularly means a great deal to me. And that was my story of Andrew and my connection. So this is what learning often looks like, a real obstacle race. And it's because educators, as we're all aware, under the TEXA guidelines in higher ed, do not need a qualification in learning and teaching. What they need, depending on where they're teaching, one AQF level above what they're teaching. The problem with that is even when you're teaching at a master's level, as I am, PhD, which is what's required there, does not necessarily mean you can teach. So an analogy I use is thinking about netballers, because I'm an Australian netball umpire. There are some netballers who are really great netballers and terrible umpires. There are some netballers who are great netballers and can umpire. And then there's the reverse. Some netballers are not so great at playing, but they're great umpires. It's a different skill set. So we've got to focus on what do our educators require so that instead of creating this obstacle course, they can create a really clean line for the students with whom they work. So how can we create that? Through teaching excellence. You may notice this is not a typical lecture, and that's because I understand enough about concentration spans. If you're not actively engaged in some way or another, then, you know, one or two of you might stay with me. One or two of you may look like you're staying with me, and some of you will be off grocery shopping. So this is the anxious brain, and this is the curious brain. So anxious brains come into the room, and we need to, through our work as educators, get ourselves in a great space so that our mirror neurons are firing off in a learning space to create curiosity. If we're anxious, our students are going to be anxious. If we're curious and keep talking about what we're learning, they will continue their journey more readily. This also goes to the core of the effective impact. If we're feeling all of those feelings, we're going to be distracted because the feelings come from, particularly threat, comes from the back of the head, and we want the front of the head operating. So this is from Barb Oakley's work, Learn It, Link It. I just love the simplicity of it. So we start off with the average brain. It's just nothing much firing up. We start the learning process and all of these neurons start to connect with each other and fire up. And then we extend it by creating links between things. And over time, those links become more and more complex. So there's been many ways of expressing this, but I think this is the most elegant, and I won't bore you with all of the other synonyms for this. So we need to engage and focus when people are first in the room, and that is just the chitty chat to begin with, which I do every single time. How you going? How's your week been? All that kind of stuff, because I don't know what people are coming in from, and they need to be able to get in the room. And sometimes in that process, people will send me a private message on Zoom saying, you know, something's happened that's been pretty awful. In COVID, there were students that had just been sacked. They're in one very memorable group. We were in a breakout room. The person came out of the breakout room because their partner had arrived home, and she messaged me privately to say, my partner's just got sacked. That means neither of us have any income. That's scary stuff. And so it needs some attention paid to it. So engaging and focus is really important. We create a narrative because, as John McLeod and many researchers talk about, we remember narratives and we apply those narratives to practice. We create lots of active learning because we know that without active learning, information won't move to the long-term memory, which is where we want it to be. And we extend and deepen it through novel application. So as we have conversations around the college, you will hear some of my novel applications, but more importantly, I'll be inviting all of you to tell me about yours, because that's so crucial to share that information. So this is the crowded brain, and unfortunately, lots of our curriculum seems to be focused on crowding the brain. I just want you to take a moment to think about working memory before I go to the next slide. How many items do you think the average person can hold in their working memory? Might just like to jot that down for yourself while I take a sip of tea. So some of you may have come up with Miller's research, 7 plus or minus 2, which gives a range of 5 to 9 items. I'm just going to put a little cross through that now. Barb Oakley, based on the most recent research, says that working memory can only hold 4 items for the average person. If we try and add too much, this is what happens. And multitasking impairs memory and learning. So let us go back to the previous slide when I put singing up and all of that information, and you were trying to look at that and listen to what I was saying. That's an overload for the working memory. So we want to be mindful of that. And I think in our learning and teaching plan, of course, we talk about it around cognitive load. And there's no time to go into the different forms of cognitive load, but let's just say it's a bit more complicated than simply the information that we're presenting. So we can use lots of strategies to make information accessible to the learners and to create opportunities for them to integrate the learning into their already existing schemas or adjust their existing schemas. So educator relationship with learners, it's a key to success. And I'm not sure if George is on at the moment, but anybody with the business orientation within the college, I just want you to hear the word attrition, because that's the thing that sends chills through all of us when we talk about how do we create retention. So this goes right back to the 2009 Aussie survey. Now, this was the precursor to Quilt, which we currently have. It was conducted through 30 Australian universities and almost 26,000 responses from both students and educators. So just 2 major highlights with a couple of stats underneath. This was the correlation between educator relationships with learners and their retention. So the learners were asked to rate their relationship with their educators, And this is what we found out. A poor relationship led to 75% of those students thinking about quitting their courses, changing courses, or doing something like that. We broadly call that attrition. Stark contrast, isn't it? Only 19% if they had a good relationship, an excellent relationship. So this is why I think we can make an argument that the educators are our greatest tool in combating the attrition. So what do the educators think about student satisfaction and student retention, stroke attrition? Well, most of them thought that certainly student satisfaction is important. We get that drummed into us. And of course, although we don't have the typical American tenure system, particularly as sessional educators, you know, if you get poor ratings, you're probably not going to be asked to come back. So we want to create student satisfaction. The problem with that is it can promote a real entertainment factor and a real, the bell curve or the skewing of marks is created inadvertently because of the fact that we want people to like us, so we'll give them high marks. Not a great outcome, and it's an inadvertent thing of placing too much emphasis on student satisfaction alone. But only about half of those people thought student retention was important. So that is interesting to me. So here's a different pen, philosophy, education and neuroscience. And again, I'm pulling this in because it takes me back to some of the things that I learned along the way and where I am now. Let me just admit to you all, I cannot speak Latin, so I'm just going to do Australian Latin, which is probably going to be really Australian for those of you who actually know how to speak Latin. So you might recognise René Descartes. My PhD supervisor, his PhD was in philosophy, and I could not resist. Every time I'd talk about Descartes, I'd say, oh, you know Descartes? And he would just like pull his hair out. But here is Descartes. And the next two people I want to talk about are Martin and Booth. Ferenc Martin was the founder of phenomenography, the research methodology, which I used in my PhD. That's why I like Ferenc so much. And he and Shirley Booth wrote this fabulous book on learning and awareness. And here's our friends back, Damasio and Imordino Yang. So what did they say? Cogito ergo sum. Cognosco ergo sum. Sentimus ergo dissimus. So I'm going to assume that you don't know all of that Latin because I didn't. So well-known quote, I think, therefore I am. Sorry, Renee, you missed something. I experience, therefore I am. Yes, you've got it, but not quite there with the emphasis. We feel, therefore we learn. And when we look at those steps of learning, when we're oblivious, unconsciously unskilled, oh, we don't know, so we don't care. Then we start to get uncomfortable because we don't know, and that's often the point at which somebody will enroll in a course. And then they work through and they get the skills, and you hear this so often when you walk around small groups practicing skills, and they're kind of doing textbook answers. Oh, it sounds like you are upset. That's the phony stage of it, where people are really so conscious about getting it right, and so they're really consciously skilled. But eventually, with enough practice, which I think is one of the hallmarks of ACAP, they integrate it into that unconsciously skilled. That's the joy of being an educator, watching that happen. So that's why for me, the educators are the heart of ACAP. We're the link between what all of the other teams do and support in a whole variety of ways. The educator relationship with that learner, it can intervene early if the learner is struggling. It can do a referral process to student learning services or to the unit coordinator or the national educator, whoever it might need to be. And it also, in times of struggles and obstacles or lack of clarity and confusion, if the student feels like they can come to us and just say, huh, then that's a really good space to be in. So to conclude, I'm going to call on my friend Mark Treadwell. He's a New Zealander. No matter how old or how expert, we must now live a dual life as an educator and as a learner. And it is now impossible to be one without the other. That is how I concluded my PhD after 220 agonising pages. And I thought it encapsulated what I thought I knew at the beginning, but what was reinforced as I went through and did the research. So to finish from a learning perspective, I started with the acknowledgement of both being the recipient, and I'm very appreciative of being the recipient, but also how much this means to me personally and professionally. I've drawn on Sengi and also at Learning Ecology for Jackson and given you a couple of insights from the neuroscience and other principles of learning that I apply and reinforce that I know they work because the learners tell me they do. I'm now concluding and we can move into Q&A. So questions, or maybe you've got some feedback. I'll stop sharing. So I'm going back to the chat. Oh, good, Raf. I'm glad that you're a Penn Principal fan, as am I. Grant, that's a lovely analogy of that building, like layers of onions, and we can't do any of that building if there's not a trusting relationship, because people aren't going to say they don't know or they're confused if they don't have a relationship with us. Yeah, so 53%, Catherine. Crikey, okay. It was 2009, maybe we're a bit more informed now. So Grant, they didn't focus on student success particularly, although I've got the link there and I think in another part they do talk about that. I just wanted to make my case for educators being at the heart of ACAP. So you can follow the link when you get the slides. And again, Jane, exactly in that link, it'll show you what is important. And there's a lot of things about how you communicate with students, etc. Sharon, I'm imagining on the basis of that comment that you've actually found some value in it, and perhaps just as the closing of this, it might be nice to hear what any questions or any comments you might want to make. I'll hand the mic to you.
Oh, I feel like I dobbed myself in.
You don't feel any compulsion, Sharon. You can always email me.
Yeah. Well, look, I did. I feel the best word I can use is nourished. Honestly, I really do feel like this put me into a learning space that I'm thinking about a whole lot of things I haven't thought about before. And that is so exciting for me. So that's why I want to go back. I've written down like 10 readings I'm clearly going to have to do, at least. But, you know, I went to your neurodiversity workshop earlier this year as well.
Great, Sharon.
And it's literally changing how I find myself delivering to students when I'm engaging with them in the class spaces. So that is just wonderful. So I guess if I'm going to frame one question, it's like, okay, where would you recommend I start?
Yeah, start small, because as Sengi says, it's the small things that make the biggest difference. Don't overwhelm yourself because we're already busy enough, and reach out to other people to support your learning journey. It's so important for us to not be in competition with each other. And the fact that my PhD was in 2020 on learning in tertiary education, that's great. It does not make me a guru. And as I was saying earlier with Marcus, we were in the water cooler breakout room. I said, before you ask Marcus, no, I cannot define learning. It is too complex for a simple definition. So I think that's a really useful thing for us to be thinking. We work in complex disciplines, and our professional work as clinical supervisors, or in my case as a counsellor, for many of you as psychologists, etc., it is complex work we do. There are very few black and whites in our work. Basically, don't sleep with your clients, don't murder anybody, and, you know, try to be professional at all times. So beyond that, everything else is pretty grey. So we need to learn to live with ambiguity and assist our learners, because they want right black and white answers, nice convergence. We want to promote divergence in their thinking.
Christine, I was really interested and refreshed by your reference to linking learning, particularly through the neuroscience perspective. It's sort of something, you know, deep down, I think we all know instinctively, intuitively, if you're any kind of teacher. But it's good to sort of have that knowledge behind it. And I sort of I got interested in this when I was talking to Stuart Hayes about pedagogy and or pedagogy, and you know, it's similar sort of lifelong principles. So what I'd like to say is that one of the things that really is helpful to people is to encourage them to learn their students' stories so that they can make those linkages. Because if you're just shooting in the dark and you don't understand your audience, then you cannot make those linkages, and you cannot contextualize things to suit their experience.
I think that's so important, Grant, because that's the old higher ed model, that it all is transmission from us to them. But when it becomes collaborative, we learn so much more. So my mental health counselling workshop, it was going to be the start of 2 days. And I just thought, okay, so how are you going to maximise your learning from this? That was the first activity. And then the second activity, because I wanted to take their relational connection to a deeper level, I asked them just to fill in the word I am, preferred name, and something surprising is, and then they had to talk about something surprising. And I learnt so much. I had a weightlifter, a kickboxer, I had a person who had almost died twice in Bali. I had all these amazing things going on. And when I shared with them that I was the 1970 Australian women's egg throwing champion, they did not know that about me. So it humanised me. And I think those kinds of activities, that's where I want to put some effort in writing them up, getting them out there for people. So
yeah,
thanks.
if I can just share an anecdote that sort of illustrates the point, is that I was training a group of people in language literacy and numeracy, and I had this high-level doctor who couldn't understand the context that he needed to put that into until he told me that he teaches people to read x-rays. So I said, well, that's a form of literacy. So you need to understand how to train other doctors, because that was his job, in that form of literacy. So these principles carry over. So that was able to make that linkage.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And we don't want to, while using the medical analogy, we certainly want surface learning. We want a doctor, a surgeon, to know the difference between a scalpel and a sponge. That's really important surface learning. But then we want to take them deeper. Under what circumstances do you use a scalpel and a sponge? And where might it be problematic to use a scalpel and a sponge? Because that's clinical judgment. And so in all of our work, we need to take that to the deeper level. And ultimately, that's where we move from developing typical expertise into adaptive expertise. That's where our work is really needing a bit of bolstering. And I've noticed there, and Matt, I'm just going to come back to you because I've seen some really lovely comments there, but Matt and I were in a particular moment of learning together. And Matt, of course, for those of you who know him, is exceedingly professional and polite. And both of us were rolling our eyes simultaneously going, what's going on here? Because the learning organisation was so disorganised and confusing, and we're competent learners. And I just couldn't follow what we were supposed to be doing. And I'm looking at Matt and he's like looking down. So, you know, we don't want that experience for our learners. We want the learners to be engaged with each other and get all that confusion and the noise out of the way so that they can get on with the learning. So I'm mindful of time and I want to hand back to Craig. I also want to let you know, obviously I have the typical ACAP EDU AU. So if there's something I can be of assistance with in terms of promoting, not overwhelm Sharon, but perhaps a breadcrumb or I like to think of a chicken nugget, not the whole chicken. Feel free to contact me, and I do have 1,700 references at the moment in my EndNote, which is all to do with learning in one form or another. I won't share the 1,700 with you though. I'll just share what is relevant for your particular query. Over to you, Craig. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. That was a fabulous presentation. I particularly enjoyed your the visuals, and in particular that the cartoon of the students bar one sleeping through that lecture. It reminded me very much of Gary Larson's old cartoon about Billy, who came to dread his father's lectures over all other forms of punishment, which I think says a lot about how we actually how we think we are delivering content and how it's being received.